The sun blazed high over the Montana highway as 8 motorcycles rumbled into the parking lot of Miller's roadside diner. The engines roared one final time before falling silent, and the riders dismounted with the practiced ease of people who had spent countless hours on the road. Jake Sullivan pulled off his helmet and ran a hand through his gray hair, squinting against the afternoon glare. He was 53 years old, weathered by years of riding and living, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had earned respect rather than demanded it. Behind him, his crew stretched and groaned, working out the stiffness that came from 4 hours of steady riding. Linda Barnes was the first to speak, her voice carrying across the parking lot. She was 48, lean and strong, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had been riding with the Iron Wolves for 15 years, and she served as Jake's second in command. The respect she commanded had nothing to do with her gender, and everything to do with her mind and her unwavering loyalty to the club. Danny Cruz, the youngest member at 29, was already heading toward the diner entrance, his military training evident in his purposeful stride. Carl White, heavy-set and jovial, was complaining loudly about his empty stomach, drawing laughs from the others. The Iron Wolves were not the stereotypical outlaw bikers that populated movies and television shows. They were veterans, fathers, working men and women who had found brotherhood and freedom on 2 wheels. Their annual cross-country ride was a tradition that brought them together each summer, a chance to escape the mundane routines of everyday life and remember what it felt like to be truly free. They wore their leather vests with pride, patches denoting chapters and years of membership. But they were not criminals or troublemakers. They were simply people who loved the open road. Jake was walking toward the diner entrance when he heard the sound of running feet. The sound was urgent and desperate, and it made him pause and turn. What he saw made his chest tighten with immediate concern. A young boy was running across the parking lot, his small legs pumping as fast as they could carry him. The child was black, perhaps 10 years old, and his face was streaked with tears and dirt. He wore a faded blue shirt and jeans that were too big for his thin frame, and he clutched a worn backpack to his chest as though it contained everything he owned in the world. The boy ran straight toward Jake, his eyes wide with terror. He didn't slow down until he was directly in front of the older man, and then the words came tumbling out in a breathless rush. He begged Jake to hide him, to protect him, to please not let his mother find him. His voice cracked with fear and his whole body trembled like a leaf in a storm. Jake's instincts, honed by years as a father and a protector, kicked in immediately. He knelt down to the boy's level, his large hands gentle on the small shoulders. The other bikers had noticed the commotion and were gathering around, forming an unconscious protective circle. Linda's sharp eyes were already scanning the parking lot looking for threats. Danny had moved to a position where he could see both the boy and the approaching road. Carl's friendly face had grown serious, his usual jokes forgotten in the face of the child's obvious distress. Jake asked the boy his name in a calm, steady voice. The child said his name was Marcus Johnson, and the words came out between hitching breaths. Jake noticed the bruises on Marcus's arms, dark purple marks that stood out against his brown skin. There was a cut above the boy's eyebrow, crusted with dried blood. These were not the marks of normal childhood accidents. Jake had seen enough in his life to recognize the signs of abuse, and anger began to build in his chest like a slow-burning fire. Before Jake could ask another question, a car engine broke the tense silence. A sedan pulled into the parking lot with a screech of tires moving too fast for safety. The vehicle jerked to a stop near the motorcycles, and a woman jumped out almost before the engine was turned off. She was in her late 30s with disheveled brown hair and wild eyes. Her clothes were wrinkled, and she moved with the jittery energy of someone who was running on nerves and little else. The woman shouted Marcus's name, her voice shrill and angry. She demanded that he come to her immediately, using words that made several of the bikers exchange dark looks. Marcus's reaction was immediate and visceral. He let out a small cry of fear and dove behind Jake's motorcycle, making himself as small as possible. His backpack scraped against the chrome as he pressed himself into the shadow of the bike, and his breathing came in short, panicked gasps. Jake stood slowly, positioning himself between the woman and the motorcycle. He was a large man, 6 feet tall and solid, and he knew how to use his presence. The other bikers spread out slightly, not threatening, but definitely not welcoming. Linda moved to stand beside Jake, her arms crossed and her expression cold. Danny's hand had moved to his phone, ready to call for help if needed. The woman approached with angry, jerky steps. She identified herself as Karen Mitchell and claimed that Marcus was her son. Her words tumbled out in a rush, explaining that the boy was troubled and prone to lying. She said he had run away from home and that she was only trying to bring him back for his own safety. Her eyes darted from face to face, never quite meeting anyone's gaze directly. She demanded that the bikers return Marcus to her custody immediately. Linda stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. She asked to see identification that proved Karen was Marcus's legal guardian. It was a reasonable request, the kind of thing any responsible adult would ask before handing over a terrified child. Karen's reaction was telling. She became immediately defensive, her voice rising to a near shout. She accused the bikers of interfering in family business, of having no right to question her. She reached into her purse, but instead of pulling out identification, her hand came out empty and shaking. From his hiding spot behind the motorcycle, Marcus's voice was small but desperate. He whispered that Karen was not his real mother, that his actual mother had died 6 months ago in a car accident. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He had lost people he loved, and he knew the particular pain of that kind of loss. He looked at the frightened child and then at the agitated woman, and his gut told him everything he needed to know about who was telling the truth. Karen saw where this was heading and changed tactics. She took a step forward, reaching out as if to grab Marcus. Her fingers were like claws and her face twisted with something that looked more like desperation than maternal love. That was as far as she got. Danny moved with the speed and precision of his military training, stepping smoothly into her path. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. He suggested that everyone go inside the diner and sort this out properly, or he would be happy to call the police and let them handle the situation. The standoff held for a long moment, tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Karen Mitchell's eyes darted between Danny's calm face and the other bikers who had formed a wall of leather and muscle around Marcus. She seemed to be calculating her options, and none of them appeared favorable. After a long moment, she gave a sharp nod and stalked toward the diner entrance, her movements still agitated and jerky. Jake helped Marcus to his feet, keeping one protective hand on the boy's shoulder as they followed. The child was still trembling, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes now, as though he dared to believe that maybe these strangers would actually help him. The interior of Miller's roadside diner was classic Americana, all red vinyl booths and black and white checkered floors. The walls were covered with old photographs and license plates from every state in the Union. Behind the counter, George Patterson looked up from wiping down the surface and immediately sensed that something serious was unfolding. He was 72 years old, a former sheriff who had run the diner for the past 20 years after retiring from law enforcement. His eyes, still sharp despite his age, took in the scene with practiced assessment. Jake guided Marcus to a booth in the back corner, a position that gave them a clear view of the entrance and exit. It was an old habit from his years in the service, always knowing where the doors were and who was coming through them. Linda slid into the booth beside Marcus while Jake took the seat across from them. The other bikers spread out through the diner, casual but watchful. Danny remained standing near the entrance, his phone now visible in his hand. Carl positioned himself near the kitchen door, and the others took seats at the counter where they could observe everything. Karen had taken a booth on the opposite side of the diner, as far from Marcus as she could get, while still being in the same room. She was making a show of looking at the menu, but her hands were shaking so badly that the laminated pages rattled. Her leg bounced up and down under the table in a constant nervous rhythm. She kept glancing toward the door as though expecting someone to arrive at any moment. George approached with a pot of coffee and a gentle smile for Marcus. He set down a glass of water and asked the boy if he was hungry. Marcus nodded shyly, and George promised to bring out some food without making the child ask. The old man had seen a lot in his years, both as a sheriff and as a diner owner, and he recognized a scared kid when he saw one. He also recognized trouble brewing, and his hand moved to the phone behind the counter, ready to call for backup if things went sideways. Linda spoke softly to Marcus, her voice taking on a maternal quality that contrasted with her tough exterior. She asked him if he was hurt, and Marcus shook his head. The bruises were old, he said, from a few days ago. Linda's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice gentle. She told Marcus that he was safe now, that nobody was going to hurt him or make him go anywhere he didn't want to go. The boy's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they seemed to be tears of relief rather than fear. Jake leaned forward, his elbows on the table and his voice low. He asked Marcus to tell them what happened, to explain why he was running and why he was so afraid. Marcus looked at Karen across the diner, then back at Jake. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his words coming slowly at first and then faster as the story poured out of him. Marcus explained that his mother, Patricia Johnson, had died in a car accident 6 months earlier. The pain in his voice when he spoke of her was raw and real, the kind of grief that could not be faked. He said his mother was everything to him, that she had worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. She had always told him that as long as they had each other, they could handle anything. Then one day she didn't come home from work. A police officer came to the neighbor's house where Marcus was staying and told him there had been an accident. His mother was gone, and Marcus's world had shattered into a million pieces. He had no other family that anyone could find. His father had never been in the picture, and his grandparents had passed away before he was born. Social services had been trying to figure out what to do with him when Karen appeared. She said she was his mother's friend, that Patricia had talked about Marcus all the time. She offered to take him in temporarily while they looked for a more permanent solution. The social worker had seemed relieved to have an option that kept Marcus out of the foster system, at least for a while. For the first 2 weeks, Karen had seemed nice enough. She gave Marcus a room, fed him regularly, and even asked about his schoolwork. But then things changed. Karen's boyfriend, a man named Vincent Cole, moved into the apartment. Vincent was tall and mean-looking, with cold eyes that made Marcus uncomfortable. He didn't like having a kid around, and he made that clear from the start. Marcus was told to stay in his room when Vincent's friends came over, which was often. Strange people came and went at all hours, speaking in low voices about things Marcus didn't understand. The food became less frequent, and the kindness disappeared entirely. Karen started looking at Marcus differently, like he was a problem to be solved rather than a child to be cared for. Vincent ignored him most of the time, which Marcus preferred to the alternative. When Vincent did pay attention to him, it usually meant Marcus had done something wrong, like making too much noise or coming out of his room at the wrong time. The bruises on his arms came from Vincent's grip when he was being dragged back to his room after making the mistake of asking for dinner when guests were present. 3 days ago, everything got worse. Marcus had been in his room, trying to do his homework by the light coming under the door because Vincent had taken the bulb from his lamp. He heard voices in the living room, louder than usual. Vincent and Karen were arguing about something, and curiosity got the better of Marcus. He crept to his door and opened it just a crack, just enough to hear. Vincent was angry about money. He said they needed more cash and they needed it fast. Karen suggested they use Marcus for what she called a special job. She said the boy was perfect because he was young and looked innocent. Vincent agreed, saying they could send Marcus across state lines with merchandise that nobody would suspect a kid traveling alone. They could make $10,000 easy, maybe more if they played it right. Marcus didn't fully understand what they were planning, but he knew enough to be terrified. The word merchandise sounded wrong, like he wasn't a person but a thing to be used. He had heard enough stories about kids who disappeared, about bad things that happened to children who trusted the wrong people. His mother had always warned him to be careful, to never go anywhere with strangers. But what did you do when the danger was inside your own home? He made a decision in that moment. He would run. He waited until the next morning when Karen and Vincent were both asleep, their bedroom door closed. Marcus moved as quietly as he could, grabbing his backpack and stuffing it with his few belongings. He took the photograph of his mother from the nightstand in his room, the only picture he had left of her. Then, because some instinct told him it might be important, he crept into Vincent's room. Vincent kept a drawer locked in his dresser, but Marcus had seen where he hid the key. His hands shook as he opened the drawer, terrified that Vincent would wake up and catch him. Inside were papers and photographs, things that Marcus didn't fully understand but knew were wrong. He grabbed what he could fit in his backpack and closed the drawer as quietly as possible. Then he ran. He had been walking and hiding for 3 days, sleeping in parks and behind buildings. He used the little money he had found in Vincent's drawer to buy food from gas stations. He was heading west because that was where his mother had always said they would go someday, to see the ocean. When he saw the motorcycles pull into the diner, something told him these were people who might help. He didn't know why he trusted them, but desperation made him brave. Across the diner, Karen had stood up. Her face was flushed red and her voice rose to a shout. She denied everything, calling Marcus a liar and a troubled child. She said the trauma of losing his mother had made him unstable, that he made up stories and couldn't be trusted. She demanded that the bikers release him to her custody immediately, or she would have them all arrested for kidnapping. Her voice was shrill and desperate, and it drew the attention of the few other patrons in the diner. Jake stood slowly, his face carved from stone. He told Karen in a voice that brooked no argument that they were calling the police and Child Protective Services. Everyone would wait right here until the authorities arrived, and then they would sort out the truth. He suggested that if Karen really was Marcus's legal guardian and had nothing to hide, she should have no problem waiting for official verification. Karen's face went from red to white in an instant. She looked at Marcus, then at the bikers, then at the door. For a moment it seemed like she might try to grab the boy and make a run for it. But Danny was still standing near the entrance, his military bearing making it clear that getting past him would not be easy. Instead, Karen grabbed her purse and headed for the door, announcing that she was going to get the police herself, and when she came back with them, all of these bikers were going to jail for interfering with her parental rights. She slammed out of the diner and everyone heard her car start up. But she didn't drive away. George Patterson set a plate of food in front of Marcus, a cheeseburger and fries that looked like a feast to the hungry boy. Marcus looked up at the old man with grateful eyes and whispered, a thank you so soft it was barely audible. George patted his shoulder gently and told him to eat up, that growing boys needed their strength. Then George moved to the front door and turned the lock with a decisive click. He had seen enough in his years as sheriff to know when a situation was about to get complicated, and he was not about to let trouble walk through his door uninvited. Jake watched Karen through the window, his mind working through the possibilities. The woman's behavior was all wrong. If she really was Marcus's legal guardian with nothing to hide, she would have stayed and welcomed the police involvement. Instead, she had fled outside and was now making phone calls while watching the diner like a hawk. That meant she was either getting her story straight with someone or calling for backup. Neither option was good. Danny had already dialed a number on his phone and stepped away to speak quietly. He was calling in a favor from an old friend who could help verify Marcus's story and get the right people involved. Danny had served in military police during his time in the Army, and he still had contacts in law enforcement. More importantly, he knew who to call when a situation involved crimes against children. His friend Helen Price now worked for the FBI in their Crimes Against Children division, and if anyone could cut through red tape and get Marcus proper protection, it was her. Linda was sitting close to Marcus, her presence a comfort to the frightened boy. She asked him gentle questions about his mother, letting him talk about happier times. Marcus's face lit up when he spoke about Patricia. He said she used to sing while she cooked dinner, that she always had a hug waiting when he came home from school. She worked as a nurse's aide at a hospital during the day and cleaned office buildings at night, but she always made time for Marcus. She helped with his homework, went to his school events, and told him every single day that he was loved and important. The pain of losing her was written all over Marcus's face. He said the hardest part was that he never got to say goodbye. One moment she was there, kissing him on the forehead and telling him to be good for the neighbor. The next moment she was gone forever. He didn't even get to go to her funeral because he was in the hospital himself, being treated for shock. By the time he was released, it was too late. He never got closure, never got that final moment to tell her he loved her. Jake felt his throat tighten listening to the boy's story. He had children of his own, grown now with families of their own, but he remembered what it was like to want to protect them from every hurt in the world. Patricia Johnson had clearly done her best to raise her son right, to give him love and stability even when money was tight. Now her boy was sitting in a diner, bruised and terrified, running from people who should have been caring for him. It made Jake's blood boil. Carl had joined them at the booth, squeezing in beside Jake. He was a big man with an even bigger heart, and seeing Marcus's thin frame and scared eyes had affected him deeply. Carl had 3 daughters of his own, and he could not imagine anyone hurting a child like this. He asked Marcus if he needed anything else, if there was anyone they could call who might help. Marcus shook his head sadly. His mother had been his only family, and everyone else she knew had disappeared after her death. People promised to stay in touch, to check on him, but those promises had faded like morning mist. Danny returned from his phone call, his expression serious. He crouched down beside the booth so he could speak to Marcus at eye level. He told the boy that he had called a friend in the FBI who specialized in helping kids in bad situations. Helen was taking Marcus's case seriously and was already mobilizing resources. Federal agents were being dispatched to their location, but it would take time for them to arrive. Danny's job now was to keep Marcus safe until help got there. Marcus asked in a small voice if he was in trouble. The question broke the hearts of every adult in the room. Danny assured him that he was not in trouble at all, that he had done nothing wrong. In fact, Danny said Marcus was very brave. Running away when he knew he was in danger was the right thing to do. Asking strangers for help took courage. Marcus was a smart, brave kid, and his mother would be proud of him. Jake asked Marcus about the backpack he had been clutching so desperately. The boy pulled it closer, his fingers tightening on the straps. Jake explained gently that if there was anything inside that could help prove his story, or protect him from Karen and Vincent, they needed to know about it. The evidence could be the difference between Marcus being returned to danger or being kept safe. It was Marcus's choice, Jake said. They would not force him to show them anything, but they wanted to help and needed all the information they could get. Marcus looked at each of the bikers in turn, his young eyes searching their faces for something. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find it. He slowly unzipped the backpack and began pulling out items. First came a few articles of clothing, worn and too small for him. Then a photograph of a smiling woman holding a little boy, both of them laughing at the camera. Marcus's fingers lingered on the photo before he set it carefully on the table. That was his mother, he said quietly. That was taken 2 years ago at his birthday party. Then Marcus pulled out items that made the temperature in the room seem to drop 10 degrees. There were documents, official-looking papers with seals and signatures. Jake picked one up carefully and began to read. It was a birth certificate, but not for Marcus. It was for a girl named Sophie Martinez, age 8, but the document looked wrong somehow. The paper too new and the ink too fresh. Jake picked up another one. This was a social security card for a boy named Timothy Chen, age 10. Again, something was off about it. Linda was looking through more papers, her face growing darker with each one she examined. These were forged identity documents, she said quietly. Someone was creating fake papers for children. There were at least a dozen different documents, all for kids between the ages of 6 and 12. The quality was good enough to pass a casual inspection, but anyone who looked closely would spot the inconsistencies. But that was not the worst of what Marcus had taken from Vincent's drawer. There was a small notebook, the kind you could buy at any drugstore. Inside were handwritten entries that read like a ledger. Names were listed in one column, followed by dates, locations, and dollar amounts. The amounts ranged from $5,000 to $20,000. Some entries had notes beside them like delivered or in transit or pending. The implications were horrifying. There were photographs as well, printed on regular paper as though someone had taken them with a phone and printed them out. The photos showed children, different kids of various ages and ethnicities, but these were not happy photos like the one Marcus had of his mother. These children looked scared. They were in unfamiliar settings, blank rooms with no decoration or personality. Some of the children had bruises visible on their arms and faces. One little girl was crying, her face red and swollen with tears. Danny took the notebook and began photographing each page with his phone. His military training had taught him the importance of preserving evidence exactly as it was found. He made sure to capture every detail, every notation, every horrible entry in that ledger. His jaw was clenched so tight that muscles stood out along his neck. He had seen evil in his time overseas, had confronted terrible things in war zones. But this, the deliberate exploitation of vulnerable children, was a special kind of evil that made him want to put his fist through a wall. Carl had picked up one of the photographs, a picture of a young boy who looked to be about 7 years old. The child was sitting on a bare floor, his knees pulled up to his chest and his face turned away from the camera. Carl's hands were shaking as he set the photo back down. He asked Marcus in a voice rough with emotion where Vincent kept these things. Marcus said they were in a locked drawer in Vincent's bedroom, that he had seen Vincent put things in there late at night when he thought nobody was watching. Jake felt a cold rage building in his chest, the kind of anger that came not from hot impulse but from deep conviction. This was bigger than Marcus. The evidence in this backpack suggested that Karen and Vincent were part of something much larger, a network that was buying and selling children like they were merchandise. The word that Marcus had heard them use suddenly made sickening sense. They were trafficking kids, vulnerable children who had lost their families and fallen through the cracks of the system. Linda was examining a burner phone that had been at the bottom of the backpack. She powered it on carefully, and the screen lit up with a series of encrypted messages. She could not read most of them, but some were visible. The messages used code words and abbreviations, but the general meaning was clear enough. People were coordinating the movement of what they called packages from one location to another. Dollar amounts were discussed. Delivery schedules were confirmed. George Patterson had been watching from behind the counter, and now he came over to see what had everyone so grim-faced. When he saw the photographs and the ledger, his face went hard as granite. He told them that in his 30 years as a sheriff, the tall man with the shaved head and neck tattoos walked away from Karen's car and toward the diner, with a confident stride that suggested he was used to getting his way. This had to be Vincent Cole, the boyfriend that Marcus had told them about. Even from inside, Jake could see the cold calculation in the man's eyes. Vincent was studying the diner's layout, counting the motorcycles in the parking lot, assessing the situation like a general surveying a battlefield. He made no move to enter, simply stood outside the locked door and stared through the glass. Marcus had gone very still when he saw Vincent. All the color drained from his face and his breathing became quick and shallow. Linda put her arm around his shoulders and pulled him close, positioning herself between the boy and the window. She told Marcus softly that Vincent was not getting anywhere near him, that he was safe inside with people who would protect him. But Marcus was shaking again, his whole body trembling with fear. He whispered that Vincent was very dangerous, that he had heard the man talk about hurting people who got in his way. George Patterson moved behind the counter and pulled out an old shotgun that he kept for emergencies. He checked that it was loaded and then set it on the counter where everyone could see it. George said in a voice that carried authority that this was his establishment and he had every right to refuse service to anyone. He also had every right to protect his customers from threats. He had called the local police 10 minutes ago, and they were on their way. Until law enforcement arrived, nobody was getting through that door unless George said so. Jake appreciated the support, but he knew they were in a dangerous position. The men outside outnumbered them, and they were clearly not concerned about legal consequences. People who trafficked children were not the type to worry about assault charges. They had too much to lose if Marcus's evidence became public. Jake had to assume that Vincent and his associates would do whatever it took to get that backpack and silence the boy who could expose their operation. Danny was still on the phone with Helen Price, giving her real-time updates on the situation. Helen told him that federal agents were en route but were still at least 45 minutes away. Local police had been contacted and were closer, maybe 15 minutes out. Helen stressed that Danny needed to keep Marcus safe and keep the evidence secure. That backpack contained everything they would need to dismantle a trafficking network. If Vincent got his hands on it, people would destroy the evidence and disappear, and other children would suffer. Vincent made a phone call of his own, speaking into his cell while keeping his eyes locked on the diner. When he finished, he just stood there waiting. The other men had spread out around the parking lot, positioning themselves at strategic points. They were not trying to hide their intentions. This was intimidation, a show of force designed to make the people inside feel trapped and powerless. It might have worked on someone else, but the Iron Wolves had not gotten their reputation by backing down from bullies. Jake called his club together for a quick conference, keeping his voice low so Marcus would not hear. They had to assume that Vincent was waiting for more backup before making a move. The smart thing would be for the bikers to keep everyone inside until the police arrived. But Jake was worried about what would happen if Vincent decided he could not wait. The diner had large windows, and the front door was just glass and wood. If Vincent and his men decided to force their way in, it would not take much. George's shotgun was a deterrent, but Jake did not want this to turn into a shootout with a 10-year-old boy in the middle of it. Carl suggested they call for backup of their own. The Iron Wolves had chapters all over the state, and there were brothers and sisters who would ride if called. But Jake shook his head. Getting more people involved would only escalate the situation and might put more lives at risk. What they needed was to get Marcus out of there safely and into proper custody. The evidence needed to reach the FBI before Vincent could destroy it. Everything else was secondary. Linda proposed an idea. The diner had a back exit through the kitchen. If they could create a distraction at the front, a few of them could get Marcus out the back and onto motorcycles. They could ride straight to the nearest state police barracks, which was not far away. It would be risky, but staying put and waiting for Vincent to make the first move was also risky. At least if they were moving, they had some control over the situation. Danny liked the plan. He said Helen had given him the location of the state police barracks, and he could navigate there easily. The route would take them along mountain roads where motorcycles had an advantage over cars. If Vincent tried to follow, the bikers' superior handling and knowledge of the terrain would help them stay ahead. The key was getting out of the parking lot without being stopped. Jake thought it through, weighing the risks. He did not like any of their options, but doing nothing was not acceptable. Marcus was depending on them, and other children's lives might depend on getting that evidence to the authorities. He made a decision. They would go with Linda's plan. A few of them would create a distraction at the front of the diner while Jake, Danny, and Carl got Marcus out the back. George would stay inside and keep his shotgun ready in case Vincent tried to breach the building. They explained the plan to Marcus in simple terms. The boy was scared but also determined. He said he trusted them and would do whatever they asked. Jake felt a swell of pride at the kid's courage. Marcus had every reason to be paralyzed with fear, but instead he was ready to take action. His mother had raised a strong son. George led them through the kitchen to the back door. The alley behind the diner was narrow but empty. Carl's motorcycle was the biggest and most stable, so he would take Marcus as a passenger. Jake and Danny would ride escort, one on each side. They would head straight for the highway and then take the mountain road to the state police barracks. No stops, no detours, just a direct run to safety. Before they left, Linda did something that surprised everyone. She took off her leather vest, the one with all her patches and years of membership, and wrapped it around Marcus. The vest was too big for him, but Linda said it would help protect him if they took a spill, and it would mark him as one of their own. The Iron Wolves took care of their people, she said, and Marcus was under their protection now. The boy looked up at her with tears in his eyes and hugged her tight. The distraction team moved into position at the front of the diner. They would make a show of preparing to leave, revving engines and drawing attention to the motorcycles near the entrance. With luck, Vincent and his men would focus on the obvious activity and miss what was happening at the back. It was not a perfect plan, but it was the best option they had. Jake gave Marcus a reassuring smile and told him to hold on tight to Carl. No matter what happened, Marcus should not let go. Carl would keep him safe. The big man nodded seriously and promised Marcus that he had ridden through storms, across deserts and over mountains. A few bad guys in cars were not going to stop him from getting this boy to safety. Danny checked his phone one more time. Helen was tracking their location and had alerted the state police to expect them. Officers were being positioned along the route to provide backup if needed. Danny put the backpack with all the evidence securely on his own bike, strapping it down so it would not shift during the ride. That backpack was precious cargo, and he would guard it with his life if necessary. The moment arrived. Linda and the others at the front of the diner started making noise, calling to each other and moving toward their bikes. They turned on engines, revved them loud enough to rattle the windows. Vincent's attention shifted to the commotion, and he moved toward the front of the diner with two of his men. George opened the back door quietly. Jake went first, moving quickly to his motorcycle and starting it with practiced efficiency. The engine rumbled to life, powerful and ready. Danny was right behind him, and Carl brought Marcus out last. The boy climbed onto the back of Carl's bike, wrapped his arms around the big man's waist and held on like his life depended on it. Because it did. They were rolling before Vincent realized what was happening. One of his men at the side of the building saw them and shouted a warning. Vincent spun around, his face contorting with rage when he saw Marcus on the motorcycle. He ran toward them, but he was too slow. The bikers were already accelerating out of the alley and onto the side street. Carl kept Marcus low and tight against his back as they opened up the throttles. The motorcycles roared like angry beasts as they picked up speed. Jake led the way, his years of riding experience guiding them through the streets toward the highway. Danny rode beside Carl, constantly checking their six to see if they were being followed. They reached the highway on-ramp and merged into traffic. Behind them, Vincent had made it to his truck and was giving chase. Karen and two other vehicles were right behind him. The pursuit had begun, and now it was a race to reach safety before Vincent could catch them. Marcus held on to Carl with every ounce of strength he had, the wind whipping past them as they flew down the highway. The boy was terrified, but he was also filled with hope. These strangers, these bikers in leather and chains, had become his protectors. They were risking everything to save him, and he was determined not to let them down. The highway stretched before them like a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the Montana landscape, and the three motorcycles moved in perfect formation. Jake took point, his eyes constantly scanning the road ahead for obstacles or threats. Danny rode on Carl's right side, protecting Marcus and keeping watch on the vehicles behind them. Carl kept his speed steady and his movements smooth, mindful of the precious cargo he carried. Marcus was pressed against his back, arms locked around his waist, and Carl could feel the boy's rapid heartbeat through his jacket. In the mirrors, Jake could see Vincent's truck gaining on them. The vehicle was a large pickup with a powerful engine, and it was being driven with reckless abandon. Vincent was weaving through traffic, forcing other cars out of his way. Karen's sedan followed close behind, and two more vehicles brought up the rear. They were not trying to hide their pursuit anymore. This had become a desperate chase with everything on the line. Danny pulled his phone from his pocket with one hand, a dangerous maneuver at high speed but necessary. He hit the speed dial for Helen Price and put the call on speaker, tucking the phone into his jacket where he could hear it over the wind and engine noise. Helen's voice came through asking for their status. Danny shouted over the roar of the bikes that they were on the highway heading east, pursued by 5 vehicles, and they needed help now. Helen's voice was calm and professional despite the urgency of the situation. She told Danny that state troopers were moving into position ahead of them. There was a checkpoint being established at mile marker 47, where they could get protection. The distance was about 12 miles from their current position. She stressed that they needed to maintain speed and stay ahead of the pursuit until they reached the checkpoint. Once they were under police protection, Vincent would not be able to touch them. Jake pushed his bike harder, opening up the throttle. The speedometer climbed past 80, then 90. Carl matched his speed, his big hand steady on the controls. Marcus was holding on so tight that his fingers ached, but he did not loosen his grip. The wind tore at his clothes and hair, and the world became a blur of speed and sound. He was more frightened than he had ever been in his life, but he was also exhilarated. These men were saving him, and he could feel their determination in every movement of the motorcycles. The highway began to climb as they entered the foothills of the mountains. The road curved and twisted, following the natural contours of the land. This was where the motorcycles had an advantage. Jake leaned into the turns with practiced grace, his bike responding to the slightest shift of his weight. Danny and Carl followed his line, trusting his judgment completely. The trucks behind them had to slow down for the curves, unable to maintain the same speed through the turns. But Vincent was not giving up. His truck scraped against the guardrail on one particularly sharp turn, sending up a shower of sparks. He did not slow down. If anything, he pushed harder, driven by desperation and rage. The other vehicles struggled to keep up, falling behind as the road became more challenging. It was now just Vincent's truck and Karen's sedan in close pursuit. A sign flashed past indicating they were approaching mile marker 40. Jake felt a surge of hope. 7 more miles to the checkpoint and safety. But 7 miles could feel like 700 when you were running for your life. He glanced in his mirror again and saw Vincent's truck closing the distance on a straight stretch of road. The man was clearly an experienced driver, using every bit of power his vehicle had. Danny saw it too. He shouted to Jake that they needed to put more distance between themselves and the pursuit. If Vincent got close enough, he might try to force them off the road. A car could survive a crash that would be fatal to a motorcycle, and Vincent had nothing to lose at this point. Danny suggested they take the next exit and use the back roads through the mountains. It would take longer to reach the checkpoint, but the narrow roads would make it almost impossible for the trucks to follow its speed. Jake shook his head. Helen had said troopers were positioning themselves at mile marker 47 on this highway. If they changed routes, they might lose that protection. They needed to stay on course and trust that help was coming. He told Danny to get ready because things were about to get rough. Vincent's truck pulled alongside them in the left lane. Through the window, Jake could see Vincent's face twisted with fury. The man gestured violently, shouting words that were lost in the wind and engine noise. Then Vincent swerved right, trying to force the motorcycles off the road. Jake reacted instantly, braking hard and dropping back. The truck shot past them, narrowly missing Carl's bike. Marcus screamed but did not let go. Carl's voice boomed over the noise, telling Marcus he was doing great and to just hold on a little longer. The boy pressed his face against Carl's back and tightened his grip. He tried not to think about how fast they were going or how close the truck had come to hitting them. He thought instead about his mother, about how she had always told him to be brave. He was being brave now, and he hoped she could see him somehow. Karen's sedan tried the same tactic from the right side, attempting to box them in. But Danny was ready. He accelerated ahead and then cut sharply in front of Karen's car, forcing her to brake hard to avoid a collision. The momentary separation gave Jake the opening he needed. He gunned his engine and shot forward with Carl and Marcus close behind. They were flying now, pushing their machines to the limit. Mile marker 43 flashed past. 4 miles to go. Jake's heart was pounding and sweat ran down his face despite the wind. He had been in dangerous situations before, both in the military and in his years of riding. But this was different. This was not about him. This was about a scared kid who deserved a chance at a normal life. Failure was not an option. Behind them, Vincent had turned his truck around and was coming back for another attempt. The man was relentless, driven by the knowledge that if Marcus reached the police with that evidence, his entire operation would collapse. Everything Vincent had built, all the money he had made from his evil trade would be gone. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. That made him dangerous in a way that went beyond normal criminal desperation. Danny shouted a warning as Vincent's truck came roaring up from behind at an insane speed. The man was no longer trying to force them off the road carefully. He was going to ram them directly, willing to risk his own life to stop them. Danny made a split-second decision. He dropped back, putting himself between the truck and Carl's bike carrying Marcus. If Vincent was going to hit someone, it would be Danny. Jake saw what Danny was doing and felt his chest constrict with fear for his young friend. But there was no time to argue or plan. Danny had made his choice, and it was a brave one. Jake focused on getting Carl and Marcus clear, opening up even more distance. Vincent's truck slammed into Danny's motorcycle from behind. The impact sent Danny's bike skidding sideways, but Danny's skill and reflexes saved him. He managed to keep the bike upright, fighting for control as the motorcycle fishtailed across the lane. For a terrifying moment, it looked like he would lose it and go down hard. But Danny had learned to ride in combat zones, and he had faced worse. He straightened out the bike and accelerated away from the truck, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The attack had cost Vincent, though. The impact had damaged his truck's front end, and steam was now rising from under the hood. The vehicle was losing power, falling behind. Karen's sedan had also dropped back, either because she was not as committed to the chase or because she saw that Vincent's reckless tactics were going to get someone killed. Mile marker 45 appeared ahead. 2 miles to safety, Jake could see flashing lights in the distance, red and blue against the sky. The state troopers were there, waiting for them. He shouted to Danny and Carl that they were almost there, that they had made it. Relief and exhaustion washed over him in equal measures. The checkpoint came into view, and it was beautiful. 4 state trooper vehicles were parked across the highway with their lights flashing. Officers were standing ready, and they had created a safe zone that Vincent could not penetrate. Jake led the motorcycles through the opening in the barrier, and they came to a stop behind the police line. Officers immediately surrounded them, creating a protective wall. Marcus was shaking as Carl helped him off the motorcycle. The boy's legs were unsteady, and he would have fallen if Carl had not held him up. But Marcus was smiling through his tears. They had made it. He was safe. The nightmare was finally over. Carl hugged Marcus tight and told him he was one of the bravest kids he had ever met. The boy buried his face in Carl's leather vest and cried, releasing all the fear and tension that had been building for days. Behind the police line, Vincent's damaged truck came to a smoking halt. Officers approached with weapons drawn. ordering Vincent and Karen to exit their vehicles with hands up. Vincent sat in his truck for a long moment, staring at Marcus with such hatred that it made several officers shift their hands closer to their weapons. Then he slowly opened his door and stepped out, hands raised. He knew when he was beaten. Karen followed, and both were quickly handcuffed and placed in separate patrol cars. The state troopers established a secure perimeter around Marcus and the bikers, treating them as protected witnesses rather than suspects. An ambulance had been called to check Marcus for injuries and provide medical attention if needed. The boy was physically exhausted and dehydrated, but considering what he had been through, he was in remarkably good condition. The paramedics gave him water and juice while they examined the bruises on his arms and the cut above his eyebrow. Marcus sat quietly through the examination, occasionally glancing at Jake and Carl as if to reassure himself they were still there. Helen Price was already making phone calls, mobilizing resources and coordinating with law enforcement agencies across multiple states. She stood near her vehicle with her phone pressed to her ear, occasionally jotting notes in a small notebook. Her expression was grim but determined. She had seen cases like this before, but each one still had the power to anger her. Children were supposed to be protected and cherished, not bought and sold like commodities. The people who trafficked kids deserved no mercy, and Helen would make sure they received none. A senior state trooper, Captain Morris, approached Jake with questions. He was a tall man in his late 50s with gray at his temples and a weathered face that spoke of decades in law enforcement. He needed to understand exactly what had happened, from the moment Marcus first approached the bikers to the chase that had just concluded. Jake walked him through the timeline, keeping his account clear and factual. Linda, Danny, and Carl added details when needed, each of them providing pieces of the story. Captain Morris listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When Jake finished, the captain told them they had done the right thing. He said that many people would have looked the other way, not wanting to get involved or assuming that the situation was not their business. The Iron Wolves had chosen to protect a child in danger, and that choice had likely saved Marcus's life. It might also save the lives of other children who were still trapped in the trafficking network. George Patterson arrived in his old truck about 20 minutes later, having closed the diner to come check on Marcus and the bikers. The old sheriff was relieved to see everyone safe and gave Jake a firm handshake. George said he had contacted the rest of the Iron Wolves who had stayed behind at the diner, and they were all fine. Vincent's associates had left after receiving a phone call, presumably the one telling them that Vincent had been arrested. The situation at the diner had resolved without violence, though George admitted he had been prepared to use his shotgun if necessary. Marcus was released by the paramedics with instructions to get rest, proper meals, and follow-up medical care. Helen explained to him that he would be placed in temporary protective custody while they searched for family members and worked through the legal process. She assured Marcus that he would not be going back to Karen or anyone associated with Vincent. The boy nodded, accepting this information with a maturity beyond his years. He asked if he could say goodbye to the bikers before he had to leave. Helen agreed, and Marcus walked over to where Jake, Danny, Carl, and Linda stood. The boy looked small and vulnerable despite Linda's vest still wrapped around his shoulders. He told them thank you in a voice that shook with emotion. He said he did not know what would have happened to him if they had not helped, but he was grateful they had. His mother had always told him there were good people in the world, and the bikers had proved her right. Jake knelt down and put a hand on Marcus's shoulder. He told the boy that he did not need to thank them. What they did was what any decent person should do when a child needed help. But Jake said he was proud of Marcus for being brave enough to run away when he knew he was in danger, and for being smart enough to take evidence that could help other kids. Marcus's mother had raised him right, and Jake wished he could have met Patricia Johnson to tell her what a good job she had done. Carl gave Marcus another big hug, lifting the boy off his feet for a moment. He told Marcus that he had an honorary place in the Iron Wolves now, and if he ever needed anything, he just had to call. Carl slipped a piece of paper into Marcus's hand with his phone number written on it. He said that when Marcus got older, if he still remembered them and wanted to visit, they would teach him how to ride a motorcycle properly. Marcus laughed through his tears and promised he would remember. Danny crouched down and fist-bumped Marcus, telling him that he had more courage than most adults Danny had served with in the military. The boy had kept his head in a crisis, had trusted his instincts and had done everything right. Danny said that Marcus was going to be okay, that the hard part was over. There would be challenges ahead, but Marcus had already proved he was strong enough to handle them. Linda took back her vest reluctantly, saying Marcus could keep it if he wanted, but that it might be too big for him to wear comfortably. Marcus returned it with reverence as if he was handling something sacred. Linda told him that the vest had ridden through 48 states and had never been worn by anyone outside the club until today. That made Marcus special, she said. He would always be part of their story, and they would always be part of his. Helen approached and gently told Marcus it was time to go. A social worker had arrived to transport him to a safe location where he would be cared for until family could be found. Marcus nodded and took one last look at the bikers who had saved his life. Then he turned and walked toward Helen's vehicle with squared shoulders and his head held high. Jake watched the boy go and felt a tightness in his chest. He had grandchildren around Marcus's age, and he could not imagine them going through what this kid had endured. But Marcus had survived, and with proper support and care he would heal. The human spirit was remarkably resilient, especially in children. Marcus would carry scars from this experience, but Jake believed the boy would ultimately be okay. The bikers spent another hour at the checkpoint giving official statements and answering questions. Captain Morris made it clear that they were not in any trouble, and that their actions would be documented as heroic intervention. The state police would need to stay in touch as the investigation progressed, but the bikers were free to leave whenever they were ready. As the sun began to set, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and purple, the Iron Wolves prepared to ride. They had lost most of the day to the crisis, and their planned route was completely disrupted. But none of them complained. Some things were more important than schedules and destinations. They had made a difference in a child's life, and that was worth any inconvenience. Jake led the group back toward the diner where the rest of their club was waiting. The ride was quiet and reflective, each of them processing what had happened. Danny's bike had damage from where Vincent's truck had hit it, but it was still rideable. He would need to get it checked out properly when they reached the next town, but for now it would hold together. When they arrived at the diner, the other Iron Wolves greeted them with relief and pride. News of the chase and rescue had already spread, and several local bikers from other clubs had stopped by to offer support and congratulations. George had reopened the diner and insisted on feeding everyone for free. He said it was the least he could do for people who had turned his restaurant into a fortress to protect a child. As they sat in the diner eating burgers and drinking coffee, the bikers talked about Marcus and what would happen next. Linda expressed hope that the boy would find good family to take him in, people who would love him and give him the stability he deserved. Carl was already making plans to set up a fund to help with Marcus's future education, saying that the club could organize fundraisers and collect donations. Danny was in contact with Helen, getting updates on the investigation and the search for Marcus's relatives. Jake sat quietly, listening to his club make plans to support a boy they had only met hours ago. This was why he loved these people, why he had spent 15 years riding with them. The Iron Wolves were not just a motorcycle club. They were a family, bound together by loyalty and shared values. When one of them saw someone in need, they all stepped up to help. That was the code they lived by. Helen called Danny's phone around 9 o'clock with news. They had located Marcus's aunt, a woman named Claire Johnson who lived in Oregon. Claire had been searching for Marcus since Patricia's death, but had been given false information by Karen about where the boy had been placed. When she learned that Marcus was alive and safe, she had broken down in tears of relief. Claire was making arrangements to come to Montana immediately, to be reunited with her nephew. The news lifted everyone's spirits. Marcus would have family, real family who wanted him and would care for him properly. He would not be lost in the foster system or placed with strangers. Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders, knowing that the story would have a happy ending for the boy. Helen also reported that the evidence from Marcus's backpack had been examined by FBI analysts, and it was even more valuable than initially thought. The documents and ledger were providing leads to a trafficking network that operated across 8 states. Arrests were already being planned, and search warrants were being prepared. Vincent and Karen were facing federal charges that would put them away for life, and the investigation was only beginning. 3 weeks had passed since that dramatic day at Miller's roadside diner, and the aftermath continued to unfold like ripples spreading across water. The story had made national news, with headlines praising the motorcycle club that had saved a child from human traffickers. Jake Sullivan found himself doing interviews with reporters, though he tried to deflect attention away from himself and toward Marcus's bravery. The boy had been the real hero, Jake insisted. All the bikers had done was give him the protection he needed to escape a terrible situation. The FBI investigation had exploded into something far bigger than anyone initially expected. The evidence from Marcus's backpack had provided investigators with the keys to unlock a massive criminal enterprise. The ledger contained not just names and transactions, but also coded references to locations where other children were being held. FBI agents had executed coordinated raids across 8 states, rescuing 11 children who had been trapped in the trafficking network. The youngest was just 6 years old, the oldest was 13, and all of them had heartbreaking stories of loss and exploitation. Vincent Cole had tried to cut a deal with prosecutors, offering information about other traffickers in exchange for a lighter sentence. The FBI had listened to what he had to say, and then charged him with enough federal crimes to ensure he would never see freedom again. Vincent was facing life in prison without possibility of parole. Karen Mitchell had also been charged, though her role in the operation appeared to have been more as an enabler than an organizer. She would still spend decades behind bars, but prosecutors believed there were bigger fish to catch based on Vincent's information. The investigation had revealed that Vincent was part of a larger network run by several criminal organizations that specialized in exploiting vulnerable children. They targeted kids who had lost their parents or fallen through gaps in the social services system. These children were easy to move because nobody was actively looking for them. The traffickers would create false documentation, transport the children across state lines, and either sell them to people who wanted to adopt children illegally or exploit them in even darker ways. Helen Price had become the public face of the investigation, holding press conferences and providing updates as arrests were made. She spoke passionately about the need for better systems to protect children in crisis and for greater vigilance from ordinary citizens. She praised Jake and the Iron Wolves by name, holding them up as examples of people who saw something wrong and took action instead of looking away. Helen said that if more people showed that kind of courage, many children could be saved from terrible fates. Marcus had been reunited with his Aunt Claire Johnson just 2 days after the rescue. The reunion had taken place in a conference room at FBI headquarters, with Helen and several social workers present to ensure everything went smoothly. Claire was 42 years old, unmarried, and worked as a schoolteacher in Portland. She looked like her sister Patricia, with the same warm eyes and gentle smile. When she saw Marcus, she had rushed to him and wrapped him in her arms, both of them crying tears of joy and relief. Claire explained through her tears that she had been trying to find Marcus ever since she learned of her sister's death. She lived on the opposite coast and had not known about the accident until a week after it happened. By the time she contacted social services in Marcus's home state, she was told that the boy had already been placed with a family friend and was doing well. Karen had forged documents showing she was a close friend of Patricia's and had legal temporary guardianship. The system, overwhelmed and understaffed, had not looked too closely at the paperwork. When Claire tried to make contact, she was given a false address and phone number. She had filed missing person reports and hired a private investigator, spending her savings trying to locate her nephew. But Karen and Vincent had moved Marcus frequently, staying one step ahead of any inquiries. It was only when Marcus ran away and the FBI got involved that Claire finally learned the truth about where her nephew had been all these months. Marcus had been placed in Claire's custody with the full support of both the FBI and state social services. A judge had signed off on emergency guardianship, and Claire was already working with lawyers to make the arrangement permanent. She had taken a leave of absence from her teaching job to focus on helping Marcus heal and adjust to his new life. They had moved into a larger apartment in Portland with an extra bedroom that Claire had decorated according to Marcus's interests. The bikers received updates about Marcus through Helen, who stayed in regular contact with them. She sent photos showing Marcus smiling with his aunt, the two of them at a park or eating ice cream or simply sitting together reading books. The boy looked healthier with each new photo, his face filling out as he received proper nutrition and care. The haunted look had faded from his eyes, replaced by something closer to the innocence that a 10-year-old should have. Helen also reported that Marcus was receiving counseling to help him process the trauma he had experienced. A therapist who specialized in working with children who had survived trafficking was meeting with Marcus twice a week. The sessions were helping him talk about his fears and begin to rebuild his sense of safety and trust. Claire attended some of the sessions to learn how to best support her nephew as he healed. The Iron Wolves had been formally commended by both the FBI and the state police. Jake, Danny, Carl, and Linda received certificates of appreciation and medals for civilian heroism. The ceremony took place at the state capitol with the governor present, and it was covered by news cameras from 3 networks. Jake gave a brief speech thanking the other bikers who had helped at the diner, and emphasizing that they had simply done what any good person should do when they see a child in danger. After the ceremony, Jake was approached by representatives from several organizations that work to combat human trafficking and support survivors. They asked if the Iron Wolves would consider becoming advocates for these causes, using their story to raise awareness and help with fundraising efforts. Jake discussed it with his club and they agreed. If their experience could help protect other children or support organizations doing important work, they were willing to be involved. The club organized a charity ride to benefit organizations that supported foster children and trafficking survivors. They invited other motorcycle clubs to join them, and the response was overwhelming. More than 200 bikers showed up for the ride, creating a massive procession that stretched for miles. They raised over $50,000 through entry fees, donations, and a fundraising dinner afterward. Local businesses contributed, news coverage brought in online donations, and the event became an annual tradition. Linda had taken a special interest in Marcus's education. She learned from Claire that the boy had fallen behind in school during his time with Karen and Vincent, missing months of classes. Linda, who worked as a school administrator in her civilian life, connected Claire with resources and tutoring programs to help Marcus catch up. She also established a scholarship fund in Patricia Johnson's name that would help children who had lost parents continue their education. The fund received donations from bikers, local businesses, and people around the country who had been moved by Marcus's story. Carl had made good on his promise to support Marcus's future. He organized fundraisers within the Iron Wolves and their extended network of riding clubs. The money was placed in a trust fund that would be available to Marcus for college or vocational training when he got older. Carl said that Patricia had worked herself to exhaustion, trying to give her son a better life, and the least they could do was help make sure Marcus had opportunities she would have wanted for him. Danny stayed in close contact with Helen, receiving regular updates on the broader investigation. He learned that the 11 children who had been rescued were all being placed with family members or in carefully vetted foster homes. Each of them had their own difficult journey ahead, but they were safe now and receiving the support they needed. Danny felt a deep satisfaction knowing that Marcus's brave decision to run away and ask for help had led to saving those other children. The diner owner, George Patterson, had become something of a local celebrity. People came from all over the state to eat at the place where the rescue had begun. George put up photos on the wall showing Marcus with the bikers, along with newspaper clippings about the case and the investigation. He donated a portion of his increased profits to anti-trafficking organizations, saying it was his way of honoring the courage shown by everyone involved. The members of the Iron Wolves found that the experience had changed them in subtle but important ways. They had always seen themselves as good people who tried to do right, but now they understood the real impact that ordinary citizens could have when they chose to act. They became more aware of warning signs of abuse and exploitation, more willing to speak up when they saw something wrong. The club developed a training program to educate their members about how to recognize and report suspected trafficking or abuse. Jake received letters from around the country, many of them from parents thanking him for what he and his club had done. Some letters came from survivors of abuse or trafficking who said the story. The Montana sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and gold as autumn settled over the mountains. 3 months had passed since the day Marcus ran up to Jake Sullivan in a diner parking lot and begged for help. Now the Iron Wolves were gathering at their annual club meeting, a tradition that brought together members from different chapters to celebrate their brotherhood and plan for the year ahead. This year's gathering had special significance because they had invited 2 very important guests. Jake stood in the parking lot of the lodge they had rented for the weekend, Watching motorcycles arrive in groups of 2 and 3, the sound of engines rumbling through the mountain valley was music to his ears. He felt peaceful in a way he had not felt in a long time. The events of the summer had changed him, made him more aware of how precious life was and how important it was to stand up for what mattered. He had always known these things intellectually, but now he understood them in his bones. A rental car pulled into the parking lot, looking out of place among all the motorcycles and pickup trucks. Jake's heart lifted when he saw Marcus's face pressed against the window, eyes wide with excitement. The boy had grown in just 3 months, his face fuller and healthier, his eyes bright with life. Claire Johnson was driving, and she waved at Jake as she parked. Before the car had fully stopped, Marcus was unbuckling his seatbelt and practically jumping out. The boy ran straight to Jake, just as he had that first day, but this time there was no fear in his eyes. Marcus threw his arms around Jake's waist and hugged him tight. Jake hugged him back, blinking away tears that threatened to fall. He told Marcus how good it was to see him and how much he had grown. Marcus stepped back and smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his entire face. He said he had been counting down the days until this trip, that he had been so excited he could barely sleep. Claire approached more slowly, giving Jake a warm handshake and thanking him again for everything he and his club had done for her nephew. She said that Marcus talked about the bikers constantly, that he had their picture on his bedroom wall and told everyone at school about the day he was rescued. Claire admitted she had been nervous about bringing Marcus back to Montana, worried it might bring back bad memories. But Marcus had insisted, saying he needed to see his friends again and thank them properly. The other bikers gathered around, greeting Marcus with handshakes and hugs. Linda swept the boy up in a tight embrace, telling him how wonderful he looked. Carl lifted Marcus off his feet and spun him around, making the boy laugh with pure joy. Danny gave him a fist bump and complimented him on the Iron Wolves t-shirt Marcus was wearing. The boy beamed with pride, saying Aunt Claire had found it online and ordered it for him. The club had organized a special ceremony for that evening, and preparations were already underway. Tables were being set up for a dinner, and decorations were being hung. But first, Jake wanted to show Marcus around and let him meet more of the club members who had come from other states to be part of this gathering. Marcus was eager to see everything, asking questions about the motorcycles and listening intently to stories about different rides and adventures. As the sun began to set, everyone gathered in the main hall of the lodge. More than 60 Iron Wolves members were present, along with family members and friends. The mood was festive but also touched with emotion. Everyone knew why they were here and what this evening meant. Jake took the microphone and asked for everyone's attention. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. Jake spoke about the day they met Marcus, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. He talked about a scared boy who had the courage to ask strangers for help, who trusted his instincts even when he had every reason to be afraid. He spoke about the chase and the rescue, about the evidence that had led to saving other children. But mostly, Jake talked about what Marcus represented. He said the boy was a reminder that one person's choice to do the right thing could ripple outward and change many lives. Then Jake called Marcus up to the front of the room. The boy walked forward with Claire's encouraging hand on his shoulder. Jake knelt down to Marcus's level and told him that the Iron Wolves wanted to honor him. He said that Marcus had shown more bravery than most adults ever would, and that his courage had inspired the entire club. Jake presented Marcus with a custom leather vest, sized perfectly for a 10-year-old, with a patch that read Honorary Iron Wolf. Marcus's eyes went wide as he looked at the vest. His hands shook as he reached out to touch the leather. Jake helped him put it on and it fit perfectly. The patch was placed right over the heart, just like on the adult vests. Marcus looked down at himself and then up at Jake with tears streaming down his face. He whispered that this was the best thing anyone had ever given him besides his mother's love. The room erupted in applause, every person standing to honor this young boy who had survived so much. Marcus stood there with his new vest on, overwhelmed by the acceptance and love surrounding him. Claire was crying openly, grateful that her nephew had found this extended family of protectors. But the ceremony was not over. Linda came forward carrying a framed picture. It was the photograph Marcus had carried in his backpack, the one showing him and his mother laughing at his birthday party. The club had taken the photo and had it professionally restored and enlarged. Linda explained that they wanted Marcus to always remember his mother and the love she had given him. The frame was engraved with Patricia Johnson's name and the words, "A mother's love never dies." Marcus took the frame with trembling hands and stared at his mother's face. He had not seen this photo in months, having given the original to the FBI as evidence. Now he had it back, more beautiful than before. He clutched it to his chest and told them thank you over and over. Claire stood beside him with her arm around his shoulders, and together they looked at the image of the sister and mother they both missed. Carl stepped forward next with an announcement. He said the Iron Wolves had established the Patricia Johnson Scholarship Fund, and it had already raised over $30,000. The fund would provide educational support for children who had lost parents, helping them pursue their dreams despite their loss. The first recipient of the scholarship would be Marcus himself when he was ready for college or vocational training. But the fund would continue to help other children in Patricia's name, creating a lasting legacy. Marcus looked up at Carl with wonder in his eyes. He said his mother had always told him that education was important, that learning could open doors and create opportunities. She had worked so hard to make sure he could go to school and have what he needed. Now these bikers were honoring her memory by helping other kids like him. Marcus said he thought his mother would be proud and happy. The formal part of the ceremony concluded with a moment of silence for Patricia Johnson and for all the children who had been victims of trafficking. Then the mood shifted to celebration. Dinner was served and Marcus sat at the head table with Jake, Linda, Danny, Carl, and Claire. He ate heartily, enjoying food and company and feeling safe for the first time in months. The bikers took turns coming over to talk with him, sharing stories and making him laugh. After dinner, Carl made good on an old promise. He took Marcus outside to his motorcycle and helped the boy sit on it. With careful supervision and at very slow speed in the empty parking lot, Carl let Marcus feel what it was like to ride. The boy's face lit up with excitement as the motorcycle moved beneath him, and his laughter rang out across the evening air. Claire watched nervously but smiled when she saw how happy her nephew was. Later that night, as the party continued inside, Jake and Marcus sat on the porch of the lodge looking up at the stars. The Montana sky was clear and brilliant with countless points of light. Marcus asked Jake a question that had been on his mind. He wanted to know why Jake and the others had helped him when they did not even know him. He said he had been taught not to trust strangers, but something told him the bikers were different. Jake thought about his answer carefully. He told Marcus that his mother had raised him right by teaching him to be careful. But he said there was a difference between being cautious and closing your heart to everyone. Jake explained that the Iron Wolves lived by a code that said you protected those who could not protect themselves. When they saw a scared child asking for help, they could not turn away. It was not about being heroes, Jake said. It was about being decent human beings who cared about others. Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then he said he wanted to be like that when he grew up. He wanted to help people who were in trouble, to be someone that others could count on. Jake told him that he already was that person. Marcus had helped 11 other children by being brave enough to take evidence and run away. Those kids were safe now because of Marcus's courage. That made him a hero already, even if he was only 10 years old. The boy leaned against Jake's side, comfortable and trusting. He said he still missed his mother every single day, that sometimes the sadness felt too heavy to carry. But he said Aunt Claire was wonderful, and the bikers had become like family. He had people who cared about him, and that made the pain a little easier to bear. Marcus said he thought his mother would be happy knowing he was loved and protected,